Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Nixon from Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I am very pleased to be moderating this webinar today, where we'll be sharing with you our findings from research that we've been doing about community violence and community safety in California news. If you have any technical problems during this webinar, please contact WebEx. The number is 1-866-229-3239. And we'll also send out messages in the chat box to let you know about that number during the webinar. As I mentioned already, my name is Laura Nixon. I'm a media researcher with the Berkeley Media Studies Group. Today's presenters are Pamela Mejia. She's a senior media researcher with BMSG, and Rachel Davis, who's the managing director of the Prevention Institute. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat box and make sure to use the all participants option. That means that everyone will be able to see your question. If you feel so inspired, please feel free to use the Violence News hashtag to tweet about the webinar today. Our handles are @BMSG and @PreventionINST. We'll be having Q&A during the webinar, and whenever we ask a question of you or you want to ask a question to one of the presenters or to your fellow attendees, please submit your questions using that chat function. Before we begin, we want to make sure to acknowledge the Northern California Kaiser Permanente Benefit Department for supporting this work. We also want to thank the Prevention Institute, and particularly Rachel, Annie Lyles, and Lisa Parks for all of their work on this project. And finally, we want to thank Howard Pinderhughes, Louis Friedberg, and Chris Soderquist for their guidance on our work. Just a brief outline to let you know what we'll be doing on this webinar. First, I'm going to be turning it over to Rachel Davis. She's going to give us an introduction, letting us know about the importance of a multi-sector approach to violence prevention and why changing the discourse is so important. Then Pamela Mejia is going to be letting us know about the methods and findings of our research, talking about what we found about the news about community safety and what we've learned about connecting community safety in business and education news. Finally, we'll be turning it back to Rachel to talk about the implications of that research and then to open up a larger discussion with all of you about what are the implications and what are the next steps. So without further ado, I will now turn the microphone over to Rachel Davis.
Both with Berkeley Media Studies Group and with all of you to talk about this work and what we've been doing and what the implications are for all of our work together. If I can get my mouse to work, I'm going to move to the next slide, which I can't get to work. So I'm not quite sure what is going on here. I should be able to do this. Oh, there we go. So I want to just start with a little bit about Prevention Institute. We are a national nonprofit organization based out of Oakland, California, with offices in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. We've been around for about 18 years, and we're really formed to be a focal point for primary prevention in this country. And one of the real benefits of that as a focal point means that, that folks come to us and we reach out to folks and we get to learn a lot in that process and learn from others on the ground and groups like Berkeley Media Studies Group to really understand the context for improving practice and policy in this country. Our focus is really on changing community environments, on promoting health equity, and really focusing on prevention. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the context for this work that we've done with Berkeley Media Studies Group with support from Kaiser Permanente Northern California Community Benefits. And so through a national initiative that we facilitated called the Unity City Network, we've been working with cities around the country on their violence prevention efforts, and you can see cities that have been involved in that work with us. And what we've noticed over the last 10 years or so is that there's really emerging trends in the field in terms of practice, and that we're seeing cities develop comprehensive plans that are really balanced and include not just enforcement and criminal justice strategies as they used to include if they even had plans, but that they also include prevention and intervention, and often are focused on neighborhoods that have the highest violence rates. And significantly for what we're going to be talking about today, there's really been an increase in multi-sector engagement and coordination, which from the standpoint of a public health approach really makes a lot of sense, because we really understand much more than ever what the underlying conditions are that can either increase or decrease the likelihood of violence, and those are really conditions that are at the hands of multiple sectors. And so what that multi-sector approach means is really bringing together different sectors, each individually that has roles to play and on their own could play roles, but putting the pieces of the puzzle together to get really a much more complete, comprehensive approach to preventing violence. And what we've seen in this work as we've been moving forward is that a lot of sectors don't necessarily understand what their role is or that they have anything to do with the issue of violence prevention. And you know, we're facilitating work in one city where the director of economic development asked me, you know, why he should be involved in this work, because he didn't see the link between what he was doing and violence prevention. And so we've spent a lot of time and effort in really helping to identify what the roles of multiple sectors are, what the contributions are that they can make, and what is in it for them. And this slide here really represents work that we did with funding from Kresge Foundation and is available on our website for folks who are interested, but really for about 12 sectors and another 10 or so departments and agencies says, here's the role you can play in violence prevention, here's the contributions you can make, and here's why you'll be better at achieving your mandate if you take these actions and help make communities safer. The project we're talking about today with Berkeley Media Studies Group is really about how do we change the discourse. And we're focused on the multi-sector approach and the implications of that for changing the discourse. And I want to talk a little bit about where we've come from. So through our national unity work that I mentioned previously, we worked with Berkeley Media Studies Group on this report. They actually did the report to inform our work. And this was really about framing and violence prevention. And it was called, as you can see, Moving from Them to Us, Challenges in Reframing Violence Among Youth. And one of the big findings that came out of this study was that youth and crime and race and violence are conflated in the media. And the consequence of that is that our policies then too easily move to be fear-based and about a criminal justice approach instead of what we're focused on is advancing a public health approach. And the notion of a public health approach that isn't on enforcement and incarceration after the fact, but is really about prevention before. It's not focused on individuals as much as the entire population or communities, and it does that by reducing risk factors and increasing resilience factors. And this is really an approach that's meant to be complementary to the criminal justice approach, understanding that historically we've mostly been focused on a criminal justice focus only. And as we've been working around across the country with cities, and here you see New Orleans and Baltimore and Kansas City and Oakland, you know, highlighted, but the same could be true for many other cities, that these cities have really identified a lack of economic opportunity and educational opportunities as a major risk factor for violence. And in the work that we did with funding from Kresge Foundation, those are, you know, sectors we specifically looked at, which is education and the business sector, and you can see sort of the clips from those sections of that report. So we, you know, really started to say, how can these sectors have a role there? And of course, today our focus is understanding more about the discourse. So what Pamela's going to talk about is not only what we understand more broadly about the field and where we're at now through a media analysis, but also specifically how we can look at sort of using news in education and business sections of the newspaper to help change the discourse as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela to really share with you the study and what we found from that. And I think I just handed you the podium, Pamela.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction and for sharing some of Prevention Institute's great work with us. My name is Pamela Mejia. Thank you all for being here this Friday morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm so thrilled to be here to share some of this work with you. I don't have as pretty of a slide to introduce BMSG as Rachel does to introduce Prevention Institute, but I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about what it is that we do and who we are. Berkeley Media Studies Group was founded in 1993. We are a public health organization that focuses on the news, and our task is threefold. We research how the news talks about public health and social justice issues, from violence prevention to food marketing and beyond. We conduct media advocacy training and strategic consultation for community groups and public health advocates to better equip them to use the power of the media to build support for the kinds of public health policies they want to see. And finally, we provide professional education for journalists and youth journalists to help equip them with the tools to ask questions that will lead to the sorts of stories we want to see in the news. We're often asked here at BMSG why we focus so intently on the news, and I think the best way to explain it is to reiterate that we're a public health organization, and as such, we believe that the best way to improve health is to improve the environments where health happens, the places where people live, where they learn, where they work. And to do that, we know we need to change the policies that shape those environments. To do that, we need to reach the policymakers whose opinions shape those policies. And to do that, we need to pay attention to and ideally influence what those policymakers pay attention to. And that's the news. The news has three key functions that I want to begin by introducing. The news sets the agenda. It determines, reflects, and also selects what people and policymakers, what we think about, what we talk about. It also affects what's not being discussed. At BMSG, we often say, if people only knew about a particular issue through the news, what would they know, and what wouldn't they know? For a lot of people, that's the case. The way the media presents an issue shapes how people think about it, especially when they don't have personal experience. So it shapes the debate. And part of that shaping involves influencing what solutions appear as appropriate or popular and which ones don't. Finally, the news doesn't just reach us as the general public, it also reaches those opinion leaders I spoke about earlier. Policymakers see news as a barometer of public concern. It's a way for them to learn about issues, especially when they don't have personal experience with it. And it helps them understand what's important to their constituents, including what solutions are acceptable or unacceptable. So in light of the power of the news and our interest in changing the discourse around violence, as Rachel so eloquently spoke to earlier, we undertook 2 studies, which I'm going to speak a little bit about now. The first of these studies explored how community violence and community safety appear in California news coverage. Now, I'm using the phrases community violence and community safety very intentionally, and that's for 2 reasons. One is that we know that many of the people who do this work every day, including possibly some of you in this audience, are increasingly thinking about and doing a lot of deep thought thinking about how to and whether to use those terms because they're more holistic. They take into account everyone who's implicated in violence, not just the 2 or more people involved in a particular crime. It's also a phrase, or there are also phrases that can help us avoid some of the problematic stereotypes that are triggered by phrases like gang violence or street violence. The second reason that we're using phrases like community violence and community safety is because, as I mentioned, we here at BMSG have been looking at the news for quite a long time. In fact, in 1993, we opened our doors with studies of violence in the news. And so we had some idea of what we might find, what the stories might look like if we looked just at news about specific crimes, murder, assault, robbery. And what we wanted to know was how do those stories look, what we didn't know was how do those stories look when violence is presented more broadly as a community issue? Does it involve those many sectors and stakeholders that we talked about as having a role to play in building and maintaining safe communities? And that question leads us to our second question, changing the discourse. If we want to change the discourse to include all those actors, we need to think about what the discourse by and about those sectors is. And the best way we can see that is through the news about them, specifically business and education news. So we looked at California business and education coverage and asked ourselves, how does community violence, community safety appear, if at all? And if not, how could it? But before I dive into anything else about what we found, I want to ask this group, because I know I'm speaking to a group of people who do this work every day and do a lot of thinking about this. I'm curious, what concerns you about news coverage of violence in our communities? Is there, and anybody, and please type your answers if you have them into the chat box. Anything where when you turn on Facebook or Twitter, you open the paper, you turn on the news, you see that really bothers you, upsets you, makes you feel like things aren't moving forward, or maybe conversely, that really pleases you, that you'd like to see more of? Anybody? I'm going to be doing a lot of talking, so I wanted to make sure that we have some opportunity for a little bit of dialogue before the question and answer at the end.
And we'll just give you a moment to gather your thoughts and get those answers into the chat box.
Oh, I see some great responses here. So we see victim blaming. We see the lack of focus on positive coverage about communities, use of passive voice, that adults or other people are scared of our youth. These are really interesting points. Oh, lack of coverage of solutions. Absolutely, we're gonna dive into that. Oh, language like rioting. Terms like the victim was known to the police, as if that justifies the violence and makes communities safer. Decontextualizing coverage of violence, making it individualized as opposed to structural. See here, it always seems to be the top story on local news. Ariana points out they don't talk much about how they're taking steps to solving problems long-term, not short-term. Misleading headlines. These are some great responses. And I see another kind of reference to there's an absence of coverage of the positive. Everything is very deficit and problem focused. Well, these are great, great responses. Thank you so much. And, you know, we had a lot of similar concerns that guided the way that we went forward with this work. Now, I love methods, as anyone can tell you, but because it's a webinar and it's Friday and I know no one cares quite as much as I do, I'm going to just briefly say a few words about what we did to try to address some of these questions. And all of these results are available in a memo that was just published today on our website that I'm sure Heather will share the link with you. We looked at California news coverage, focusing on Northern California, but also with some Los Angeles Times thrown in, from January of 2013 to June of 2014. We looked at the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Contra Costa Times, San Jose Mercury News, Sacramento Bee, and the Oakland Tribune. And we looked at the online and the print the online and print versions of those papers. In future, we'd love to do more social media, but that wasn't an option for this project. And we explored any stories that referenced community violence, community safety, or any variants thereof, you know, violence in communities, safety in communities, safety of communities, anything like that. We developed a coding instrument. That's basically a list of questions that we asked ourselves on reading each article that was informed not only by our previous work, but also by the work that the great work that some of the Unity cities that Rachel mentioned earlier have done, as well as really powerful and insightful interviews with folks in the field, including Rachel, but also Howard Pinderhughes of UCSF and others. Now, what did we find? Well, the first question people always ask is, well, how does it show up? You know, how many stories are there? And what we found was that there wasn't too much. Articles that talk about community violence or community safety very rarely appear in the news, particularly in comparison to stories about murders, for example. That's that top green line you see on the chart that's currently on screen. Those stories appear much, much, much more frequently in California news. And I know that some of the folks in this audience also are doing work around trauma and adverse childhood experiences, so I want to mention that we too are doing some work on that, and that until very recently, these lines looked quite similar for work on trauma and adverse childhood experiences as well, although that coverage is changing. So we know that when we talk about community violence and safety more broadly, it doesn't get as much attention as stories about murder, stories about individual crimes, those stories that we sort of know what we're going to see, that many of our participants just spoke about. We unfortunately know that violence happens every day. Violence in communities happens every day, and also work to build safe communities happens every day. So what is it about a particular story that makes it rise to the top of a reporter's mind or makes it appealing to an editor? In other words, what makes a story newsworthy? Why are stories published in the news that day? And what we found is that overwhelmingly, stories about community violence or community safety were in the news because of a new development in an initiative or a program to address community violence or build safe communities. So what that might look like would be something like a discussion of a new angle in the progress of a community safety partnership in an area of Los Angeles, or perhaps a recent letter from a concerned organization relating to prison reform. It might be in the news because there was a new website released, or a new website unveiled to track perpetrators of sexual violence, or an article about the recent passage of a piece of bail reform. These are all examples of the kinds of milestones and initiatives or programs that made stories newsworthy. The second most common reason a story would be in the news was because of a new development in a criminal justice case. So somebody was arrested, somebody was arraigned, somebody went to trial or filed an appeal. What I want to say is that this is a really unusual pattern. Almost always when we look at violence in the news, the main reason that it's there is because of a milestone in the criminal justice system, that little red wedge right there. because somebody's been arrested, because somebody has been hurt, because somebody is at trial or about to be. So this is a really unusual pattern to see that when news about community violence or safety appears in the news, it's usually because of a program or a policy or some work to address safe communities. The next question that we ask ourselves, and this is maybe the question that everyone asks themselves when they think about the news, is, well, what were the stories about? What themes popped up when we looked at all these stories, well, not that many, but at these stories about community violence and community safety? And these were some of the top themes. And I want to point out again, I want to point out two things here. Make that three. The first thing I want to say is that themes aren't mutually exclusive. So you'll notice here that these bars are going to add up to more than 100% because one story could have a lot of different themes in it. The second thing I want to say is that the most common topic of a story is solutions. Almost 75% of the stories about community violence or community safety talked in some way about a solution to community violence. That is really unusual. That is absolutely not what we are used to seeing at all, because usually conversations, as was mentioned earlier during our text box conversation, usually stories about violence are focused on the problem and not on the solution. Now, this all sounds very positive, and it is, but I want to also make one caveat, one final third point. And that is that not all solutions are necessarily the solutions we want to see. Some of them might be that enforcement or punitive solutions that Rachel spoke about earlier that tend to be our default when we think about violence. So those are kind of the three takeaways that I think should probably underscore this slide and this presentation, this commentary about what the articles were about. The only other thing I want to say is that the second most common topic you'll see there is called causes of violence. Again, very unusual. That usually doesn't show up when we talk about, when in the news about violence. But the articles that we were looking at were from 2013 and 2014 when realignment and other policies were underway in California. And that led to some really interesting and potentially problematic conversation in the news about who's responsible for violence. What I mean is that in a good number of the stories we saw, there was some back and forth about people being released from prison under the new policies, and that was what was causing violence in communities. So you can see where that could be some potentially problematic framing, some potentially problematic framing, but also represents some opportunities to talk about the deeper, the more nuanced causes of violence, the ones that we can address as a community. When we think about the news, we also want to think about who's talking and whose voices are being left out. I'm going to pivot here to a slide that might not surprise too many people in this audience, didn't necessarily surprise us, which is that about 1 in 2 stories that appeared in the news about community violence or community safety featured a criminal justice representative as a speaker. And most of those speakers were, in fact, police officers and their representatives. The second most common speaker was government representatives, although they appeared far less frequently. And after that, a lot of voices were absent. So community residents, community-based organizations, faith communities, health and mental health services, representatives of schools and business districts. Those voices weren't necessarily heard in the news coverage. As everyone at BMSG is tired of hearing me say, it's not a limitation, it's an opportunity. And I know Rachel will be digging into that a little later on. Well, finally, before we start thinking about the business and the education sectors, I want to say a few words about solutions. That was something that came up a lot during our earlier conversation. We wanted to know how solutions are characterized in the news, and the first step to talking about solutions is thinking about who's held responsible. When we talk about solving violence or addressing violence, do we just talk about what victims should do or what cops should do? Or do we think more broadly about what community institutions can do? I see, before I pivot, I see a great question. Where's public health? That's a really good question. They're in that little tiny bar at the bottom, mental health and health services, Linda. Anyway, so as I said, we wanted to say, I got distracted there for a moment because that's such a good question. So we wanted to think about solutions. We wanted to think about responsibility. Who's held accountable? And what we found is that, by and large, institutions are held accountable. When the news about community violence or community safety addresses solutions, addresses responsibility, it talks about what institutions, the fabric of our society, need to do to address the problem. And the main institutions that are held accountable are state government and the criminal justice system, as well as, to a lesser extent, the local government. Now we know who's held responsible. We wanted to know, well, what are they told to do? What kinds of solutions appear in that coverage? Are they preventions designed to stop violence before it happens and build safe, strong communities? Are they interventions designed to address violence after it happens? Are they punitive? Are they restorative? What kinds of solutions appear in the news? Now, whenever I present this data, people always say, well, I don't see why you asked that. You know what's going to be there. It's going to be all about after the fact. It's too hard to talk about prevention. So I wanted to put that question to this group and ask, what, if anything, is hard about talking about prevention? Or what makes it easier? So if people want to, I'm going to give everyone a moment to gather their thoughts, and if you want to type some answers into the text box. It's boring. That is it's very difficult to, as Annie was mentioning earlier, kind of bring the innovation sometimes and the newsworthiness to prevention. It's not as flashy, hard to define short-term gains. You don't get immediate results, too big and too overwhelming. Can be difficult to show what's prevented. That's a fantastic point. So some really, really good points and concerns here about the challenges of illustrating prevention. Oh, people don't understand prevention with respect to violence. I think that's a great pivot and a great thing to think about, because what our question then was, well, if prevention appears, how does it appear? And if it doesn't appear, what does? To return to an earlier question, if people only knew about preventing community violence and building safe communities through the news, what would they know? What would they see? Well, what we found is that whether we're talking about prevention or whether we're talking about intervention, policing is the most commonly proposed solution. When we saw prevention in the news, which was fairly often, it was almost always in the context of preventive policing, more police on the streets to stop crime before it happens. When we saw conversations in the news about addressing violence after the fact, about what we might call in public health intervention, again, the response was sentencing policy and policing. More and harsher arrests, longer sentences, more jails. Well, what does that boil down to? I think maybe the best way to think about it is that the news about community violence, by and large, has many, many interesting opportunities and strengths, but it tends to be a story about criminal justice told by criminal justice. So what does that mean for that multi-sector approach that Rachel spoke to earlier? If we want to build that multi-sector coordination and the other approaches that it suggests that go beyond criminal justice, if we want to bring in other speakers and give them a voice, how can we do that? Where should, then, community violence appear? And so I wanted to put this to the group. If we want to think about other opportunities and other speakers and bringing in other folks, where in the news, where in the media should community safety appear? Put another way, in your ideal world, every time there's a story about what, it would include community safety. So I know that's a bit of a framing and participatory exercise, but I'm just very curious to hear about where you'd like to see conversations about safe, healthy, sustainable communities in the media, and prevention at that. Youth leadership, it's about money, what sells. It's a great point and definitely segues well into our conversation about the business sector. There's some great conversations happening here, and I'm really I'm almost sad to have to move on to our next slides. I just want to dive into what's going on here in the chat box. Employment. Every time there's a story about employment, it should include community safety. Fantastic point. Weave it into human interest stories about people succeeding, schools, jobs, et cetera. Wonderful. So bringing in some of those sectors we spoke about earlier, the education, the business sectors. Okay, and Annie provides a fantastic example from the CDC about business. She says, a CDC-supported evaluation of 30 business improvement districts in Los Angeles found a 12% drop in robberies, an 8% drop in violent crime, and substantial economic benefits because savings from the decline in robbery alone offset implementation costs. So here's some fantastic examples of how a story about business could indeed include community safety. Noelle says, stories about hate crimes or discrimination. Well, fantastic points, and these are excellent suggestions. I feel like in some ways I've planted you all in the audience because these are such great segues to talking about the work we were privileged to do next. Well, you all know by now how much I love my methods, but what I'm going to do is, again, just say a few quick words about the methods that we employed to explore potential opportunities to talk about community violence. And these methods and all of the data that I'm going to talk about are also available on our website in a new report that was also released today that I'm sure Heather will share the link with you to. Well, here again, we looked at papers from Northern California as well as the Los Angeles Times. And our task here was to look at the business and education sections to explore where there were themes that could connect with the causes of and solutions to community violence. We also refined and expanded that list by interviewing experts, again, like Rachel, like Howard Pinder-Hughes, like consultants who work with the business sector, researchers and reporters from EdSource and elsewhere. We also finally conducted a literature review and looked at any work that had been done on stories and themes from business and education to see what might we expect to see in these stories and how might it connect with our issue of community safety. I want to reiterate here, I know Rachel spoke about this earlier, but we specifically examined the business and education sectors because even though we know that community violence affects every sector, these two were really jumping out at us from Prevention Institute's earlier work as unique places to explore the impact of and solutions to community violence. For instance, we know that in the business sector, community violence can interfere with employee productivity and retention. And in the education sector, it can interrupt student learning and attendance. But conversely, both of these sectors can play an important role. Play an important role in building safe communities. I got so excited there. As we saw a little bit about earlier from Annie and others, businesses can promote community safety by providing economic opportunities, reducing poverty. The education sector, the schools where communities' children spend most of their days, that can play an important role in youth development and in helping them learn the skills and techniques to be safe and healthy and productive. So that was our rationale for picking these two sectors and moving forward with our analysis. Well, the first question we asked ourselves was, well, does community safety appear in the business and education sectors? We know it has a role to play. Maybe it's already there. We were very optimistic. And what we found is that once in a while, community safety and community violence prevention did show up in the education sector, but only very rarely. We found a total of 4 stories that explicitly discussed the impact of community violence on students, especially young men of color, and how schools in California are addressing that impact. So the first article up here on the screen reads, is from the San Francisco Chronicle, and it talks about how the first homicide of the year was a student from Alliance Academy, and it concluded with a teacher observing many of our students have a lot bigger things than learning math to take care of and deal with. A second article from the LA Times focused on unaccompanied minors crossing the border from Central and South America and spoke about the possibility that they would be afraid to enroll or would have experienced trauma as a result of witnessing violence. A third story, the one I mentioned earlier that talks about the impact on young men of color, focused on Oakland's innovative programs to address the needs of that community and emphasized the specific issues that face boys and men of color, including community violence, mental health needs, lack of male role models, et cetera. A fourth story that I didn't include here talks about the role of an adult education program for previously incarcerated people and its role in improving community safety, or its role in reducing future recidivism. But that was 4 stories out of the education section, nothing in the business section, out of more than 300 stories that we looked at. So we had to ask ourselves, well then, where could community violence appear in news from the business sector and news from the education sector? I'll start with the education sector, since I think for us and for many that was a little bit more of an obvious connection. What we found was that in the education stories we looked at, which was, as I said, more than 100, over 40% contained some kind of theme that connected in some way with the causes or solutions to community violence. All right, well, what did that look like? We identified a number of themes that we were able to identify or kind of categorize into 3 rough groups. One way to think about those groups is illustrated up here on the screen. First is themes about how violence affects kids outside of school. So, for instance, how could violence in a community impact students in a way that may make it harder for them to be, harder for schools to educate them? A second theme focused more on schools as a location and a site. So, themes that would connect with how violence can affect kids in school. So that might be a story about school discipline. And then we might want to think about how can school discipline promote or conversely prevent a culture of violence in schools. A third group of themes that we identified touched on how the education sector can prevent or contribute to future violence, maybe by forcing kids out of school or by helping them helping them remain in school through graduation. What we found was that the overwhelming number of themes that we saw that appeared in education news tended to connect more with that third category. They were more about how they were themes that could connect with how schools can retain students, make them stronger, reduce the risk of community violence, or they were themes that connected with how schools might push students out and increase the risk of community violence. Well, I've talked a lot about themes. I want to give you some concrete examples of what those looked like. So here you see some of the themes that showed up in education stories, and I'll say a few words about the top couple and how they connected. The most common theme that we saw in education stories that we thought could connect to violence prevention was about systemic education issues that could either force kids out of school or help them succeed. And of course, that in turn would have implications for students' economic success and ultimately for community safety. The second most common theme in education stories we saw that could relate to community violence, I have to do a lot of setup each time, thank you for your patience, was opportunities for low-income students and students who might otherwise not be able to complete school or attend college. So those might be things like special classes or discounted community college tuition. Opportunities like those could increase school retention rates and ultimately decrease community violence. But again, even though these themes were really present in stories, none of them really made the connection to how these opportunities can prevent violence. What did all that look like in practice? I have a few examples here that I want to share that I think are some headlines that we saw in stories that contained potentially relevant themes. So the top story, for instance, focuses on Oakland School Superintendent Antoine Wilson's plans to raise the district's graduation rate. So that article went into a lot of detail about how students and teachers will benefit. And so we explored how that article could have gone further to eliminate how this community as a whole benefits from that benefit to students and teachers. I was a bit inaccurate earlier because I did include a little bit about the fourth story that talked about community violence. This is the story I mentioned earlier that talks about a truck driving program in Sacramento that works with formerly incarcerated individuals. The leader of that program said, if we can address the parolees' needs and they become a productive tax-paying citizen, they gain self-esteem and their family situation improves because their kids or significant others look up to them. They're less likely to revert to their criminal ways because they work and they earn something tangible to them. Now, there's some potentially problematic framing there, but it's still apparent that there are opportunities to connect with how job training and vocational programs like this one could help build safer and more stable communities. In general, we're still digging into what the implications of this are for education reporting, but I want to say that education reporters could potentially expand their reporting by pointing out the connections between stronger schools, higher graduation rates, and improved public safety. And bringing in the voices of and perspectives of community health advocates, the public health community, of others, could help make that connection, as can all kinds of data and examples that we all have at our disposal, but that maybe aren't getting the kinds of publicity and traction that they should. We didn't just look at the education section, of course. We also focused on business. And our work there was similar. We identified a number of themes that tended to appear in business stories, and we grouped them into rough categories that focused on how does violence affect doing business? So for instance, maybe a story about real estate prices could connect with how community violence can impact real estate prices in a neighborhood. We also identified a group of themes that touched on businesses as a site of violence. So for instance, themes about how businesses deal with racism, homophobia, or other issues that can contribute to a culture of violence in the community and elsewhere. And finally, we identified a group of themes that could touch on how the business sector could prevent or contribute to future violence by creating stable jobs and fostering economic stability in communities. And again, here I want to give you an example of what some of these themes that we saw looked like. Overwhelmingly, the themes that we saw in the business section tended to connect with how the business sector could prevent or, in some cases, contribute to future community violence. The most common themes in the business stories were wages and labor issues. And we know that those can affect community members' ability to maintain stable employment, to have a good quality of life. The second most common theme we saw in the news was job growth and conversely unemployment. And again, we know that both of those have important implications for how economically successful and stable a community is. Corporate social responsibility referred to the ways in which businesses sometimes undertake programs, public and otherwise, that are at times designed to improve community safety and community cohesion. Well, again, let's give you some examples. What did this look like? Well, here are some headlines from stories where we identified themes that could potentially connect with community violence and safety in the business pages. The top two stories in some way touch on the fact that communities are safer when residents have good, stable, sustainable jobs. And in fact, in the memo that I mentioned, we show how that first story about Starbucks vows to change unpredictable barista work schedules, could be modified to include connections with community violence prevention. The third story up here about Skyline High students excited about creating a mural refers to corporate social responsibility and shows how businesses can have a role to play in fostering cohesion in communities. Well, I want to close here with an example of a story in the business pages that almost made the connection. It says, children whose mothers were laid off were much less likely to graduate from high school and college. A researcher says the kids, by virtue of having less education and having some social and psychological issues, could themselves be at greater risk of job loss in the future. That's a concern, too, that we could potentially see an intergenerational transmission of job instability. It's a bit jargony there, but still. This is a story that, again, comes very, very close to making the connection between what the business sector does, how the business sector does business, and long-term community stability and safety. But it doesn't quite make that connection. How can journalists make the prevention link? In part, we're exploring ways that they can expand their sources beyond the criminal justice representatives that are usually the sources they go to. And we're also thinking about ways that community health advocates and violence prevention advocates and other allies can expand the frame when they talk to journalists to show both the economic and the social consequences of safe and stable jobs. As I said, these findings are all in their early stages, and we're really looking forward to talking with you all today and at any point about how reporters can make the connections and about how advocates and practitioners and those of us on the ground from every sector can build relationships with reporters to make it easier to tell connected and comprehensive stories about safety in communities. So with that, I want to turn it back to Rachel, who's going to do her usual magic and tell us a little bit or give us a little bit to think about what to do with this going forward and what some of this might mean.
Thanks so much, Pamela, and thanks for setting such a high bar. So that was a lot of information, and I have to say I'm in your club of, that this really is about opportunities and opportunities that we have to change the discourse. I think one among the many things you said, sort of the big picture, big take home for me in that is that at some level, this is still a story of criminal justice by criminal justice. And that has huge implications for changing the discourse because that has implications for what the story is and who the messengers are. So, I just want to take a few minutes to share some of the opportunities that I see based on the research that you all have done that can help us all together really start to shift the discourse more. So early on in this project together with BMSG, we all made a decision which was, I think, a bit of a departure than how we thought we were going to start and a departure from what we had done in the past, but we switched the frame from violence prevention to community safety. And as Pamela has just described, that shift in terms of looking at community safety creates some opportunities for us. One, and as Pamela said, this is very different from a lot of other topics they've studied in the media. A majority of the stories in the media focus on solutions. So we're already, not focused on the consequences after the fact, but what can we do about this problem? Another thing, that I think she described pretty clearly that relates to this change in frame is that there's rarely a discussion about the causes of violence in the news, and rarely references to the underlying factors that we know can increase the likelihood of violence, such as alcohol, poverty, trauma, racism. Those kinds of things occurred much less. And, when I look at some of the comments in the text chat about why is it hard to talk about prevention, and people said people don't really understand prevention, it can feel too big and too overwhelming. And what we've found is one of the advantages of a public health approach is that by identifying these risk and resilience factors for folks, that can really concretize what the solutions are. So again, an opportunity there to really help inform people's understanding of what can be done in real tangible ways. The second opportunity that's come out of this research is that the coverage of community safety really focuses on solutions and solutions that involve institutions, and that's different than what we see in other areas as well. A lot of the solutions are focused to prevention and intervention and systemic change. That being said, you know, as Pamela was pretty clear about, most often the solutions still relate back to the criminal justice system. And that really is not surprising, given that law enforcement and criminal justice reps are really the most frequent messengers. So our opportunity here is to really increase the messengers, you know, outside of sort of the usual suspects, to you know, community practitioners and advocates, as Linda said, public health, you know, to folks who understand the alternative approaches to a criminal justice-only approach. So that together and collectively, we can be changing the dialogue and expanding the solutions that get presented in the media, and ultimately, as you know, Pamela said, to policymakers who are reading the media. And then the third place where I think we have an opportunity is, you know, as Pamela said, there's very little presence in the education and business section of the news about this topic, even though they have a vested interest in safer communities. And, you know, what we saw is it rarely appears in the education news and never in the business news. And yet, you know, we know when we've talked to local businesses or employers of bigger companies where they say they don't want to locate in places that don't feel safe because they're concerned about their employees, they're concerned about their customers, and they don't do as much business. So having safe community is good for business development as well. And, you know, I think Pamela did a really good job of talking about the notion that there are a lot of places and themes within those sections of the paper where this dialogue or discourse on community safety could be injected into those conversations. You know, that can, again, start to shift the discourse as we really, I think, are fundamentally moving from the criminal justice-only understanding and approach to this issue, that helping more and more sectors understand both how this is in their interest, but also really the roles they have to play and how they can be part of a broader effort to create safe communities, it really does present a number of opportunities. So with that, what I want to do is turn things back over to Laura, who is going to help us all sort of facilitate a dialogue now and hear the kinds of things that are coming up for you.
Thank you, Rachel. And this will be the time during our webinar where we really want to hear from all of you. So please, if you've been saving up your questions during Pam and Rachel's talk, or comments that you have, things that came up for you, please go ahead and start putting them into the chat box, and we will be collecting those so that we can talk about them. And I'll start off with asking, I think, mostly Pam a question, although Rachel, please jump in if you have ideas as well. But we've talked a lot about that opportunity that's there to get more news coverage in other types of sectors like business and education. But what are some concrete steps that people working in violence prevention could take to do that?
Well, that's a great question, Laura. I am very much, I think we all at BMSG and Prevention too are really looking forward to digging into what the next phase of this work will look like. But from a preliminary standpoint, I would say, building on Rachel's commentary about building up messengers, one is to, when possible, start building relationships with education reporters and with folks who report in the business sections. And that can be as simple as following them on Twitter or other things, but making sure that you have, starting to build some kind of connection with them so that maybe the next time they have a story to write, the police won't be, or the criminal justice department won't be the only people they go to. Another opportunity, and one that I know is, I've heard people that I work with in this area express some concerns about, but also some optimism around, is actually making yourself part of that conversation. So that is things like using the opinion or editorial pages, so with op-eds and letters to the editors. And Annie right there just said, we need to use letters to the editor and op-eds. The field usually talks about it, but rarely uses them. It would be a great way to hear from youth and community. Thank you, Annie. And Heather, who is our wonderful tech facilitator, and is herself a former reporter, comments, reporters sometimes struggle to know who to talk to, so often having advocates approach them is welcomed. So I think that these two initial points really both speak to ways to make yourself more visible in the forefront of reporters' minds as a possible source, as a possible messenger. And then, of course, when you talk to reporters, it's absolutely critical to be able to provide them with some of the information, whether it's statistics and images, whether it's stories and visuals that will help them tell a story, not just about punitive after-the-fact solutions, not just about criminal justice, but about safe, sustainable communities, about the work that you and your community partners are doing to build and maintain the places that we all want to live.
Yeah,
that would be preliminary thoughts.
Great. Did you have anything to add to that, Rachel?
Yeah, thanks. Those are, I think, are really great ideas, and the thing I wanted to add, and this goes back even to the study that I talked about that Berkeley Media Studies Group did for our Unity work on moving from us, them to us, is the notion that reporters, the media often covers events as they happen, and that means that on this issue they're often covering violence after it occurs. And that what that means is we're getting these kind of individual, or I think as BMSG has called it, sort of portraits that add up together to give a picture which isn't necessarily reflective of the overall reality. And that what it's missing often is the context that things are happening in, or what BMSG has called the landscape. And so by being proactive, like Pamela was talking about, that's really the opportunity to paint the broader context, to understand what kinds of things are going on in communities that are working, and how focusing on these underlying conditions are really changing communities and changing outcomes for the better. So it's really an opportunity to get ahead of the if it bleeds, it leads notion, to say, here's how change can and is happening in community.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And I wanted to invite any participants we'd love to hear from you. Have you had any success stories about approaching reporters, or have there been challenges or difficulties that you've had in that? So if you have anything to share with everyone, please type that into the chat box. And another question that comes up for me is, and that is fascinating to me, is this question about speakers. We know that police and people involved in criminal justice are the speakers who are showing up most. Who do you think is most essential to add to that conversation? So for both Rachel and Pam, whoever wants to comment on that.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I want to harken back to a conversation I had with our executive director here at BMSG, Lori Dorfman, the other day, who I was saying we were having a similar discussion, and she said, well, at this point, a big step is just getting beyond criminal justice. So, and getting to a broader range of speakers. And so at this point, I don't necessarily have an answer to who is most essential. I think that that's going to be work that we're going to be able to explore as the frame broadens and as the range of speakers that are involved broadens. And I also want to harken back to something that Rachel had said about the tremendous experience that Prevention Institute has in bringing other voices and speakers to the fore and in bringing together lots of really interesting and powerful data that reporters might not even be aware of that comes from places other than the police department, that comes from places other than criminal justice venues. So I would think that might be a starting place, that kind of data might be a starting place to think about. If there's success stories that other people have to share about who they've brought on or who they've seen interviewed or spoken with that's been really successful, that'd be great. But otherwise, I guess I would say at this point, really, the big challenge is helping reporters move beyond only interviewing criminal justice representatives and equipping advocates and equipping the people with the knowledge and the skills and the important information to share with the tools to do that effectively.
Great.
Yeah, and what I'll add to that is I was going to say I don't think there's anyone that's most important, but then if I had to pick, I would say champions of prevention. And, you know, what we've seen in other kinds of public health issues that in some cases doctors are really credible and important messengers who can say, you know, we don't have to be sewing people up anymore. But we've also seen in violence priests saying we don't want to bury our kids anymore, you know, faith leaders. That this is such a multi-sector issue that not only so many sectors have a role in, but also have a vested interest in order to achieve their own mandates. And so, you know, I agree with Pamela that this is about getting much more balance beyond really just the primary law enforcement and criminal justice. So, you know, other folks have talked about community and youth and that these are all important voices that start to reinforce the notion that this isn't a criminal justice issue only and can shift the discourse to, you know, we're all in this together and this is really going to benefit our whole community.
Great. I think those are all great points. And we had a comment come in from Sharon talking about special event months for like domestic violence, sexual abuse awareness months, and as you said, that's been an important tool for them. And that's important to think about as you're thinking about trying to create news is what are the hooks, we call them news hooks. Why are things in the news right now? And so if you're going to go to a reporter, you can't just say, well, I want you to report about community violence. They'll say, well, what's the story? So the story might be, there's this month, we're doing all these activities. It might be, we've released this really innovative report. So that's another thing to think about as you're looking at building those relationships with reporters.
And I think that's a great kind of tie between the first questions about what can advocates do and Rachel's comments about prevention. If you can create news that's not connected to a specific incident of violence, that's connected perhaps to an awareness-raising month or prevention activities, that helps you, anytime you can create news that's not in response to an event or an incident, you're already coming from a better position to talk about prevention, to broaden the conversation, to include community perspectives, and to include prevention. So I would say that's a really great point and a good addendum to my earlier answer to the what can advocates do.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that, you know, I think that the analysis that, you know, that BMSG did about where could things occur in education and business sectors is really important because, you know, I think those months are important and, you know, that there's every other day of the year that this is really impacting communities in too big of a way. And so, you know, looking at with all the discussion, you know, about living wages now, where's the opportunity to connect this into that and talk about how important it is that people have economic opportunity, or, you know, with summer coming up, we know young people need jobs, and so how do we hook this issue into the kinds of issues that are already being you know, put into the media and being discussed in the media? And I think, you know, one of the comments that came up early on is letters to the editor and op-eds could be places to really do that and to start to inject that perspective into the media more frequently.
Fantastic point, Rachel, and we're seeing great comments, too, in the chat box that I'd really recommend everybody take a look at, where Annie Lyles from Prevention Institute is talking about other ways to create news that bring in the year-long perspective, and Doris is also talking about the upcoming release of a report that offers another hook, as Rachel says, to connect with prevention in many sectors.
Mm-hmm. Great. And this is a question, but I must admit I have some inside information about this, being another researcher at Berkeley Media Studies Group. But Pam, do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you mentioned earlier, that you're also doing work on childhood trauma and how that's being covered in the news, and doing a similar study looking at how childhood trauma could appear in the news? Would you want to talk a little bit about that work and also how that might connect with community violence?
Sure. Well, we, as you mentioned, are doing some work looking at how adverse childhood experiences, specifically, so childhood trauma, appears in the news, and how, just like we did with community violence and community safety, how it could connect with news about the business and education sectors. You know, we know that ending childhood trauma and addressing it after it's happened are multi-sectoral efforts, and we know, too, that trauma doesn't end in childhood, and trauma doesn't end with people. In fact, we have whole communities that can be traumatized. So we are really excited about and exploring this work. We will be probably talking about that and sharing some information later on this year. If folks want to remain involved, please let us know, and we'll let you know about that. I tried to highlight where I could a few similarities in terms of, at times, absence of coverage and things like that. I would say one of the really interesting things about adverse childhood, or childhood trauma in the news anyway, is that in keeping with our conversation we were just having, that tends to be information, the folks that really do work and did the early work on childhood trauma were very, very good at creating news. Their stories were almost always in the news because of an event or a report that was released or something that they were doing to create news that would draw attention not only to, you know, trauma experienced by a particular individual or group of individuals, but to the larger problems of trauma and to the need to address the systemic causes. So there's a lot of rich data there, and there's a lot of rich parallels. I think we're very much looking forward to thinking about how we can weave all this together, because, as I said, we know that trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum, violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, and trauma doesn't end in childhood or with individuals. So if we're going to address community safety, we also need to address the experiences of individuals within it and the experience of trauma in communities as a whole. And we'll look forward to speaking, if you have additional thoughts or insights about that, or information that you want to know, or things you want to share, we would love to hear more about that.
Wonderful. And we're a little bit after the hour here. I know everyone's probably ready for lunch, or if you're on the East Coast, ready for your afternoon slump. So, so I think I will open it up. Pam or Rachel, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share before we close the webinar?
Well, this is Rachel. I wanted to say it's been a real pleasure working with BMSG on this work, and we're really grateful to support from Kaiser Permanente's community benefits to support this work. I wasn't sure exactly what would come out of this in terms of really being able to inform efforts moving forward, and I've just want to sort of underline that I think this presents tremendous opportunities for all of us to really think about more deliberately how we can work together to really change the narrative and change the discourse on this in ways that's going to work much better for communities. So So I'm, anxious to continue to move this work forward and to, expand the number of folks involved in this, and really want to encourage folks to engage more with media. And I know that can sometimes be intimidating or something that not everyone has a comfort zone in, but this really does underscore that there are significant opportunities to help really shift the landscape on this. And I think, as Pamela said, that then starts to inform policymakers as well. And no doubt, that's an incredibly important piece of this work.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Pam, did you have any thoughts?
I don't really want to come after that, but I wanted to, again, echo Rachel's thanks of the Northern California Kaiser Permanente Community Benefit Department for supporting this work. We are so privileged to be able to do it and to work with Prevention Institute on it. I want to thank everyone who was able to be here today. The work that you do is tremendously important. We are privileged and honored to be able to, in some way, contribute to that. And we're so looking forward to continuing, moving forward, and we hope we'll get to do it with some of you. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful weekend.